Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking on, well, one of the most polarizing topics out there in modern agriculture, genetically modified foods.
It's a big one, and it's so easy to get lost in the noise.
Exactly. So if you've ever felt just lost in the acronyms or the science or the really heated debates, our mission today is simple. We're going to extract the core science, the precise methods, and the factual controversies.
Straight from the academic sources you've shared, the goal here is clarity, not advocacy.
Let's start right there. When we say genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, what are we actually talking about?
We're looking very specifically at organisms, mostly crops, where their genomes have been altered using targeted genetic engineering.
So recombinant DNA technologies.
Exactly. This is very different from, say, the traditional selective breeding humans have been doing for thousands of years.
And defining those terms right up front is so crucial, because not all of these modifications are the same. Right.
Not at all. For example, when scientists transfer genes between totally unrelated species, let's say from a bacterium into a corn plant, we call that resulting organism transgenic.
Okay, transgenic.
But if the gene transfer happens within the same species, or a very closely related one, it's sometimes labeled cisgenic.
And all of that falls under the big umbrella term.
Biotechnology. Yeah, which can include everything from making cheese to what we're talking about today.
It's worth remembering the timeline here, too. I mean, we've been selectively breeding plants forever.
Since antiquity. But this ability to make really precise, rapid changes with recombinant DNA, that really only kicked off in the 1970s and 80s.
Which is why the very first GM food, the Flavr Savr tomato, I think it was, only hit the market in 1994.
And since then, the scale has just exploded. I mean, today, GM crops cover something like 180 million hectares globally.
And the U.S. alone is a huge part of that.
It's about half of that global total. And here, most processed foods you'll find have at least some ingredients that come from GM crops.
Okay, so let's look at what the industry actually focused on. The Flavr Savr was all about consumer appeal, a better tasting tomato.
But the market shifted really, really fast.
Right, to farmer productivity. And that brings us to the two dominant types of GM crops that are grown today.
The biggest category, it's about 70% of all GM crops, are the herbicide-resistant ones.
70%.
Yeah. And the problem they're solving is enormous. You have weeds destroying about 10% of all crops worldwide. And the best herbicides, the broad-spectrum ones, they usually kill the crop right along with the weeds.
So the challenge was to create a crop that could survive a poison meant to kill plants.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you even engineer that?
You borrow from bacteria. Specifically, a gene called CP4 epsps is taken from a soil bacterium, Agrobacterium CP4.
Okay.
And you insert that gene into the plant. It makes an enzyme that is resistant to glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup.
I see. So the herbicide, glyphosate, it tries to shut down a critical process in the plant.
But the modified crop just uses this protected bacterial enzyme instead, so the farmer can spray the entire field and only the weeds die.
That is just next level efficiency for a farmer. Okay, the second major type then, it targets insects, the beet for crops.
Right. So these crops use specific genes called CRY genes from another soil bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, or just beet.
And what do these genes do?
This bacterium produces what are called CRY proteins, and when an insect eats them, they're toxic, but only to certain types of insects, like moths or beetles.
And what I find fascinating here is how specific that mechanism is. It's not just a general poison.
Precisely. That's the key. For it to work, the insect has to eat the protein first. Then, once it's in the insect's gut, the high pH there causes the protein crystal to dissolve.
And that activates it.
It activates the protein, which then binds to very specific, unique receptors on the gut wall. And because different insects have different receptors, you can design a crop that only targets the pest you're worried about.
Let's shift gears from these massive field crops for a moment. What about animals? I know there's only one approved GM food animal.
The AquAdvantage salmon.
Right.
This is an Atlantic salmon that's been engineered to grow to market size in about 1.5 years instead of the usual 3 years.
So twice as fast. How'd they do that?
They took the growth hormone gene from a Chinook salmon, and they coupled it with a genetic on-switch, a promoter from an antifreeze gene they found in an eel.
An eel?
Yeah. That switch basically allows the salmon to keep producing growth hormone all year, even in cold water when it would normally stop.
And The big controversy here always seems to be about them escaping, right?
Yeah.
Even if the plan is to only sell sterile females.
Absolutely. Critics rightly point out that, sterilization is almost never 100% effective. There was a study in 2013 that showed if these GM salmon did escape, they could hybridize with wild brown trout.
And the hybrids were, what, more successful?
In the lab conditions, yes. The hybrids actually grew faster and outcompeted both the GM fish and the wild fish for food.
Okay, so moving from, commercial goals to humanitarian ones.
Yeah.
One of the most famous examples has to be golden rice 2,
Right, which was engineered to fight vitamin A deficiency.
a huge global health issue.
Massive. And the problem is that while rice plants make the precursor to vitamin A in their leaves, the part we eat, the endosperm, it lacks the enzymes to finish the job. It can't make beta-carotene.
So the scientists essentially engineered that missing pathway right into the grain itself.
That's it exactly. They introduced two key genes, the CRISPR gene from a bacterium and the Cy gene, which in the second, better version, came from maize.
And those two genes complete the synthesis pathway.
They do. It causes the rice grains to produce beta-carotene, which is what gives them that golden yellow color, and it works incredibly well. The second version makes over 20 times more beta-carotene.
So a single serving could make a real difference.
Just 150 grams a day could supply a child's full daily requirement of vitamin A.
To get these results, though, the engineering process itself, it must be a huge challenge. The transformation rates are incredibly low, right? Like 1 in 1,000 cells.
That's right. Which is where these really ingenious methods come in. You have things like the biolistic method or the gene gun.
The gene gun.
It's a physical method.
Yeah.
You coat heavy metal particles like gold with the DNA you want, and you literally fire them at high speed into plant cells. You're just hoping the DNA integrates.
But the more revolutionary method uses a natural vector.
Agrobacterium tumefaciens. This soil microbe is, it's basically nature's own genetic hacker. It causes tumors in plants using a piece of DNA called the T plasmid.
So scientists hijacked that system.
They did. They figured out how to cut out the tumor-causing part and replace it with the gene they wanted to insert. They used the microbe's own natural machinery to smuggle the new gene into the plant's genome.
But even with that, you still have to find that one successful cell in 1,000. That's where selectable markers come in.
Absolutely. You have to have a way to filter out all the failures. The older way is called negative selection. You add a marker gene that gives resistance to a toxin, like an antibiotic.
And then you just wash the whole culture in the antibiotic.
You do. And only the successfully transformed resistant cells survive. Everything else dies.
But that raises some public concern about using antibiotic resistance genes. I heard there's an alternative.
There is. Positive selection. This is what was used in golden rice too. This method uses a gene called phosphomanose isomerase, or PMI.
And what does that do?
It gives the plant cells the ability to survive on a medium where mannose is the only carbon source. Mannose usually stops plant growth, but the PMI gene lets the transformed cells use it for food. So only the cells you want can actually thrive.
So for golden rice 2, it wasn't just the two beta-carotene genes. They also had to clone in that PMI marker, all into that Agrobacterium delivery system.
Exactly. Each gene with its own specific promoter or switch to make sure it expressed in the right place, and then that marker to let them find the winners. Understanding that whole package, the gene, the promoter, the marker, that's the key to this technology.
Now, all those methods we've just talked about, they created the GMOs we have today. But in the last few years, gene editing tools, Xenofen, TALEN, and especially CRISPR-Cas, have completely changed the game.
It changes everything. Traditional GM methods usually insert a whole new gene, often from a different species. That creates a transgenic organism.
But gene editing is different.
It's more like a surgical tool. It lets scientists make very precise, small changes, a few nucleotides or a small deletion, often without introducing any foreign DNA at all.
And that's where the regulations get really tricky. Because if there's no foreign DNA, many agencies don't even classify it as a GMO in the traditional sense.
Which means a much, much faster path to market. And we're already seeing the results. There's a non-browning mushroom that used CRISPR to reduce the browning enzyme.
Which increases shelf life.
Dramatically. Or pigs engineered to be immune to African swine fever. This kind of speed is just reshaping agriculture as we speak.
Okay, before we dive into the controversies, you made a point earlier that I think is really important, that making generalizations about all GM foods is, well, impossible.
It really is. Every single modification is unique. It's a different gene from a different source inserted in a different way. You just can't lump Roundup-Ready soybeans in with golden rice and assume their risk profile is the same. Each one has to be assessed on its own.
So with that in mind, let's look at the big controversies, starting with health and safety. The proponents will argue that after more than 20 years of consumption, there's no reliable evidence of any negative health effects.
But critics often counter that. They say, well, it's not a robust test because most GM foods are highly processed, so the proteins and DNA are gone. Or they're used for animal feed, not eaten directly by people.
And they also point out that with a few exceptions, like golden rice, there are very few formal human clinical trials.
That's true. But the supporters will then point to the required animal toxicity tests and the many long-term studies on things like bright corn and glyphosate-resistant soy, which haven't shown any documented negative effects.
Where the challenges seem much more obvious, though, is in the environment, especially this issue of resistance.
Yes, the initial drop in pesticide use from GM crops, that effect might be temporary. We are seeing incredibly rapid evolution.
With herbicides, for example, I think there are over 24 glyphosate-resistant weed species now in the U.S. that have popped up since the mid-90s.
It's because of the immense selection pressure. If you rely on just one chemical, you're basically breeding for superweeds. The industry's response now is to engineer crops that are resistant to multiple herbicides.
Well, we're seeing the same thing with insects, right? Resistance to the beet toxins.
We are. The western corn rootworm, for example, has developed resistance to some types of beet maize.
So how do you manage that? How do you try to stay ahead of insect evolution?
It requires a really active management strategy. The main tactic is to plant what they call refuges of non-GM crops near the GM field.
The refuges.
Yeah, these refuges maintain a large population of insects that are still susceptible to the butt toxin. They mate with any rare resistant insects that might appear in the GM field, and their offspring are usually still susceptible. It's a kind of biological balancing act.
The other big environmental worry is gene flow. The idea that these new genes could spread from GM crops into non-GM crops or even into wild relatives.
Right, through pollen. And it happens. That discovery of feral GM canola growing along roadsides in North Dakota, that's a perfect example. Some of those plants were even resistant to 2 different herbicides.
And I guess the risk really increases if the gene, say for drought resistance, gives a wild plant a real fitness advantage.
It could lead to all sorts of unknown ecological shifts. And of course, it's a huge problem for organic farmers who are trying to market their crops as GM-free.
Are there potential solutions for containment?
People are working on them. Things like using RNA interference to make the GM plant sterile so they can't spread pollen, or putting the new genes into the chloroplasts of the plant cell, which usually aren't transferred by pollen.
So as we look forward, what's on the horizon?
A lot of the research is now focused on fortifying staple crops, think bananas, engineered with extra iron and beta-carotene, or developing tolerance to really big problems like drought.
And some really creative solutions, too, I've heard.
Incredibly creative, like engineering wheat to produce an aphid alarm pheromone. It just repels the pests without needing any toxins at all.
So after all that, what does this mean for you, the learner, trying to make sense of this all?
I think the key takeaway is that GM foods are defined by these highly precise engineering methods like the gene gun or the Agrobacterium vector. They're categorized by their traits, mostly resistance. But the whole field is in the middle of a revolution because of tools like CRISPR.
Because CRISPR can make these precise changes without adding foreign DNA.
Exactly. And that fundamentally challenges our whole regulatory definition of what a GMO even is.
Which leaves us with a final thought. Given the environmental challenges we've seen, especially this rapid evolution of resistance that forces us to constantly adapt, how might these new gene-edited crops, which face a totally different regulatory path, change our long-term calculus for managing risk and ensuring agricultural sustainability? That's the question we'll leave you with until our next deep dive.